It is with great pleasure that I introduce our next speaker, Derek Pullen. Derek was former head of sculpture conservation at Tate Gallery for 30 years and is now co-director with co-author of this talk, Jackie Hoyman, of their own company, SculpCons Limited in London. Derek's long-standing relationship with the Naum Gabo estate allows for particular insight into how caretakers of an artist's legacy, in conversation with conservators, continuously adapt and accommodate new perspectives. Because of the unstable nature of some of Naum Gabo's work that their sculpture made, the making of posthumous replicas has been a strategy to secure the artist's work. Derek is in a particular unique position to provide insight and first-hand experience of the shifting attitudes towards replicas and exhibition copies. Please welcome Derek Pullen.
Thank you, Juliana, and thank you, SVA, for hosting this glorious event, as somebody said. So Christian asked me to talk about our long relationship with the estate of the constructivist sculptor Naum Gabo. And there have been many critical moments over the last 30 years when both parties, conservators and the estate, had to listen closely and understand the other's viewpoints. And we even had to change our minds from time to time. A key issue for discussion has been posthumous replicas, of which, generally speaking, there has been a negative view. I hope this account will be relevant to other artists' estates, especially those where the artist has, perhaps unintentionally, used unstable materials. But for context, I'll say a little bit about Gabo and his estate. Naum Gabo was born in Russia. His older brother was Antoine Pevsner, and Gabo took his professional name to distinguish himself from Antoine. He studied medicine and then engineering in Germany, but left at the outbreak of war in 1914 for Norway, only returning to Moscow after the 1917 February Revolution. There he encountered the Russian avant-garde. In 1920, he published the Realist Manifesto, co-signed by Antoine, which set out his fundamental principles of constructivism, that is, non-objective art for a modern industrialized society using modern materials. At about the same time, he made what is perhaps the first motorized kinetic sculpture, kinetic construction standing wave. It was based on an electric bell from a factory, he said. And this, like the hammer of the bell, sort of vibrating, which creates a single wire, creates this sort of resonance. It's now in the Tate collection, and the very fragile mechanism was replicated with Gabo's consent in 1968. Living artists, of course, can copy their own work even when they don't own it, but this work was replicated twice more, and only the final version worked as well as Gabo's original. That's based on the evidence of early photos like this. The justification for making these replicas, or exhibition copies, was that while the original existed, it was fragile. And there was also the case that Gabo insisted it wasn't really a sculpture, that it was a demonstration of a kinetic principle. Gabo eventually moved to London in 1936, where he became an influential member of a circle of British modernists, including Henry Moore, Barbara Hepworth, and Ben Nicholson. While in the UK, he was shown a water-clear transparent plastic, later to be known as Perspex, and in the USA as lucite or plexiglass. This material, acrylic sheet, and another new material, nylon monofilament, transformed his work. In the 1920s and 30s, he had used cellulose nitrate or celluloid and cellulose acetate, a less flammable alternative to celluloid. He continued to use these cellulose-based plastics for models and some sculptures. The transparency of plastics suited his aesthetic, suggesting volume, line, and space, without much mass. Gabo never editioned his sculptures. he wrote to a collector when she bought this construction that he reserved the right to make copies, further copies if required. But as my work cannot be repeated mechanically or cast, I have to do the work anew every time, so that each piece is really an original. And that was about 1946, I think, writing about this piece. This letter would have been written also at about the time he emigrated here and settled in Connecticut, where he continued to make sculptures until his death in 1977. Shortly before his death, Gabo gave the Tate Gallery a large collection of his works, including drawings, sculptures, model studies, and archive material. He was very conscious of his importance as an artist and concerned that his legacy should survive and be seen. Several early sculptures were lost or damaged during his moves between Norway, Russia, Germany, and Paris. He was compelled to repair broken constructions and often replaced components. Now, in 1984, I was hired to start a sculpture conservation department at the Tate. Plans were already well underway then for an international touring retrospective of Naum Gabo's work from both the family and the Tate collection. And that's, yes, the Dallas head is on the right. That's in, I think it's in cellulose nitrate, but it's filled, it's replicating ivory. The exhibition tour started in Dallas, where I met Charles Wilson, who had been Gabo's chief assistant in his last decade. And among much else, Charles showed me how he strung some of the constructions with nylon and wire springs. And I also met Miriam, Gabo's widow, and Graham and Nina Williams. Nina was Gabo's only daughter and now manages the copyright and the estate. The exhibition catalogue here included a catalogue raisonné, which hasn't been mentioned today, I think, but it was compiled by Christine Lodder and has been an absolutely invaluable tool for us as conservators. And whenever we treat something with an owner's permission, we send the details to the Williams for the next edition of the catalogue raisonné. Gabo's working process was to resolve an idea through a series of small prototype models and then enlarge through a further series, often with minor modifications. His most popular designs were copied by him with slight variations up to 30 times. And this was possible because he used templates for his shapes and constructed rather than carved or modeled his sculptures. Charles Wilson said Gabo was prepared to refabricate and replace damaged parts because he retained the templates. But Charles also thought that faced with the total loss of a sculpture, Gabo would have wanted a replica to be made. And Gabo did remake a sculpture for Benny Goodman, at least twice, because the musician insisted on displaying it over a radiator and in the sun. However, he was not always sympathetic to owners of sculpture needing repair, often assuming that the damages had been caused by careless handling or neglect. He sometimes kept damaged works for decades or even destroyed them and then refused to replace them. In at least one case, rather than replicate a deteriorated sculpture for the owner, he instead made his own copy. And the story of this copy involves our first close encounter with the Gabo estate. One of the works included in the retrospective was the Tate's construction in space, 2 cones. By the 1960s, Gabo was aware that the older plastics could be unstable. These are the cellulose plastics. And this led to warping, discoloration, or even disintegration. Yet he was reluctant to blame the materials, preferring to blame the owners. And this, of course, was a problem for the institutions and collectors who had bought his earlier works in plastic. And in 1967, the Philadelphia Museum of Art told Gabo that their version of this, Construction in Space, from 1937, was deteriorating and giving off a strong acetic acid smell. Gabo often demanded quite large sums for undertaking repairs because he argued he could be just as well have spent his time making new works to be sold. The ruined sculpture was sent to Gabo, and he did offer to make a reconstruction for what he called the special price of $15,000, which is equivalent to about $150,000 today. The museum politely declined his offer and had a replica made elsewhere for study purposes only. Gabo took advantage of having Philadelphia sculpture in his studio to make his own copy using, of course, his stock of old plastics, including cellulose acetate. And having struck up a strong and lasting friendship with Norman Reed, who was director of the Tate in the 1970s, he subsequently gave or sold his copy of Two Cones, this one, to the Tate. After the retrospective, the Tate's Two Cones was beginning to distort. Small beads of plasticizer appeared like sweat on the surfaces. Gabo's daughter, Nina, was very unhappy, believing, like Gabo, with Philadelphia, that it was the Tate's fault for having stored the sculpture in a closed storage box where acid fumes could build up and cause it to self-destruct. And until then, Nina had been on good terms with the Tate and generously promised more archive material and possibly more sculptures to complete her father's representation in the collection. The family's goodwill was now at risk, and we focused on understanding what was going on with Gabo's early plastics, and Two Cones in particular. Why were the parts degrading? And I say we because at this time, about 1986, my co-author on the paper, Jackie Heumann, who's unable to be here today, unfortunately, had joined the sculpture. She had joined the sculpture section and was keen to lead research on the problem. It wasn't a new problem. Nicknamed vinegar syndrome, the movie industry had been struggling with it for some time and had given up. They were now copying cellulosic films onto polyester-based film stock, and now, of course, it's straight onto digital. The estate gave us plastic samples from their archive to assist with our research, which was presented at a new materials conference where we recommended preventive measures. That's better. Such as ventilated cases with charcoal cloth as a scavenger for the acetic acid, which was off-gassing from the plastic and was potentially damaging to nearby artworks. I believe our research and practical efforts to deal with plastics degradation made an impression on Nina and Graham Williams. They were considering how best to preserve Gabo's legacy and do something in his name. They asked for a report on sculpture conservation in the UK, and in it, I had to say, there was very little opportunity for British conservators to learn about the conservation of modern sculpture as a multi-medium discipline. Object conservators then tended to specialise by material, wood, metal, stone, or ceramics. What was needed in the UK, I felt, was encouragement for multidiscipline, multimedia conservator training and research based on internships and travel grants, and to broaden the experience and reflect the techniques and materials that modern sculptors actually use. The Williams set up and endowed the Gabo Trust for Sculpture Conservation. This is it's a charity, a non-for-profit. They specifically excluded Gabo-related projects or treatments since under UK tax rules, their personal interest might damage its non-profit status. But the estate has a keen interest in conservation and funded one of the first conferences devoted to the conservation of modern sculpture, which was held at the Tate and called From Marble to Chocolate. A few of you may remember it. It was a long time ago. The Trust supports the development of sculpture conservators by educational, training and conference travel grants, and there are some people here today who have benefited. There are more details of grants and examples on their website. But meanwhile, the Tate's Two Cones continued to slowly warp and deteriorate. Nina Williams was adamant that making a posthumous copy was out of the question. Despite Gabo's disapproval, others had made replicas of damaged sculptures as an extreme form of restoration, and they weren't very good. Poor quality was a key reason that Nina rejected the idea of copying her father's work. And like any artist estate, she was constantly being asked to authenticate unauthorized copies and outright fakes. I agreed with her position then. It was traditionally, I felt, the job of conservators, explicit in our profession's ethics, to preserve art and not create it on behalf of others. But any replica always seems to be of its own time and involve a degree of invention, not intervention, on the part of the maker. But modern values and attitudes do change, and as has contemporary art itself. And Gabo's early sculptures weren't the only ones that were changing dramatically. And this was an Antoine Pevsner piece that's in the Hirshhorn, was and is. Given Gabo's contrary attitude to replicas, there were many conversations with the estate and curators, but no consensus on whether replicas were the way to go. Was there enough evidence of the sculpture's original material? Original appearance? Did we have the means and resources in skill and funds to execute a program of replica making? Gabo was not a perfectionist. His constructions are clearly handmade, and there are saw cuts and score marks visible. They are not pristine. There would have had to have been an element of interpretation, and yet Gabo had no concept of patina. He did not like his materials to alter or age with time. They were to stay as they were and be maintained in good condition. However, the works were becoming unexhibitable. We could not stop this process, but we could document the sculptures while they were still in good condition. And let's be clear here that conservators, we haven't given up on aging plastics. Conservation scientists are researching the problems and gaining a better understanding of the chemistry of the aging processes, but as yet finding few practical solutions for slowing down or preventing the decay, particularly of cellulosic plastics. By 2006, the two cones had completely collapsed, and we had lost the opportunity of documenting the original form, other than as a hologram. But other sculptures were showing early signs of decay, and with the support of the Gabo estate and funds from the Andrew Mellon Foundation, we started a project to document Gabo's most vulnerable sculptures so precisely that our data would provide indisputable evidence for future scholars. We titled the project Documentation as a Conservation Strategy, to record and archive every physical feature of a selection of Gabo's sculptures: colour, transparency, dimensions, texture, glossiness, mateness. We used an array of high-tech equipment: laser scanning, high-resolution photography, photogrammetry, and sensitive touch probes. And meanwhile, at the Tate, there were long discussions about whether to use this data to actually replicate Gabo sculptures, and if so, with what parameters. It led Tate curators to reflect on how many of the sculptures already in its collection were lifetime or posthumous replicas, and why they had been made. The ethical and moral issues were beginning to become more explicit. And here's an example that probably all know, the Duchamp Hamilton large glass, remade and partly remade again in 1985. And this is another one less well known. It's actually three sculptures by Barry Flanagan. And I put it up because we made it, a replica was made as an exhibition copy because the sandbags kept coming back damaged from loan. And I'm not at all sure whether we're looking here at the exhibition copy or the original. And perhaps we could talk about later whether that matters or not. In October 2007, Tate invited art historians, artists, artisaires, curators and conservators to a symposium to inform museum policy on replication. Many curators and art historians were unfamiliar with the term inherent vice to describe the tendency of organic materials to be flawed and to decay in time, inasmuch as they most degrade over time. Nonetheless, inherent vice proved an irresistible title for the meeting, and everybody came. There were about 30 discussion papers online, and I'd encourage you, if you're interested, to sort of read these. They're very interesting. The Getty followed up with a similar discussion shortly afterwards. And yes, there's always a little bit of rivalry. The consensus at the meeting was that good reasons could usually be found for making a replica, but it was critical of what had been done in the past. Some replicas conflicted with surviving evidence of an artist's work or speculated way beyond the evidence. In fact, there were many justifications, aesthetic, historical, and educational, but it came down to, I felt, to the need and mood of the moment and what was legally permissible. The Gobber estate, or Nina and Graham, participated in the Inherent Vice Symposium and presented a paper. They said they would permit a project to replicate 3 of Gabbo's sculptures from the 1930s, but there were strict guidelines and legal contracts or licenses drawn up which described exactly how the replicas were to be indelibly identified and used, what steps required their approval as the project proceeded, and in which ways this was and was not a precedent for future work. And as with most legal agreements, it was a slow business to reach the final draft, but enormously helpful to us as the project managers to have clear guidelines and a process proposal agreed beforehand. Our challenge, we felt, was to create benchmark examples for future conservators so that when the estate's copyright expires, its intentions continue to be respected. The replicas were almost, in a sense, a byproduct of the project to see how accurately one could document three-dimensional constructions. After all, any replica itself could be damaged and would itself age and perhaps be replaced. We needed to provide the evidence to replicate the original when not a trace of it existed. Much discussion went into what a replica should replicate, what evidence was there for the original appearance of Gabbo sculptures. Some were more than 50 years old when they were acquired by the Tate. The intention was to base appearance on best evidence, warts and all, but in fact, the constructions were so logical that it was possible to reverse engineer them, to say with confidence that this had been a flat sheet or that a straight line. Although we had used high-tech stuff to record the constructions, when it came to actually making the replicas, our conservator, Nick Corker, found that old-fashioned hand tools, like those Gabbo used, a great deal of persistence and an extremely critical eye were the essential tools. We were helped by being able to compare our measurements with templates from the Tate archive donated by the estate, and to date 3 replicas have been made. The first 2 were put on exhibition, inviting visitors to respond to the display of clearly labelled replicas. There were no adverse comments. In fact, there were no comments at all, and I do wonder how many people actually realised they were looking at replicas. So in conclusion, I'll just run through a couple of these. This was the first sort of card model, just trying out the idea. And then you have the original on the right and the replica on the left. And another view. And we're talking about very subtle distinctions. It's almost a level of connoisseurship, like wine, to get a sense of the nature of the plastic. We worked with the artist estate with a common purpose to both conserve the sculptures and keep Gabbo's ideas accessible. We arrived over many conversations to a position regarding replicas that we would have originally rejected. Indeed, it was also the position of the estate that no replicas should ever have been made. But it led us to research and evolve techniques for recording sculptures that captured evidence of how they were made, what materials were used, and most importantly, what they looked like from every angle. It was a very expensive solution, and the project continues as Tate's resources and funds allow. But there are skilled conservators there now who do this work, and that is due in large part to the generous support from the Gabbo Trust to training sculpture conservators in the UK and encouraging their professional development. To replicate the sculptures was a joint decision between the estate as copyright holders and Tate as owners. Cultural attitudes have changed towards replicas and no doubt will continue to change. I think what we are doing is appropriate for now. It may be frowned upon later or praised. And I'd like to think Gabbo would have approved, but who knows? Thank you.